Today we're going to talk about all the tanks in Midnight, but before I start in the actual specs, there's something far bigger to address, and that's that tanking itself is changing this expansion. And that's not fluff. Trust me, a lot is going on here. So, Midnight's dungeon changes have been brutal to the dungeons. Mob packs are smaller, casters are fewer and further between, and many more mechanics exist within the world of Warcraft rather than the UI of Warcraft. So to make up for that, well, you've got a lot more time to react to things. Now, of course, you won't have access to computational add-ons, but to make up for that, Blizzard have given you a lot more time to react to things in the actual dungeon. And do you know what that means? That means that tanks are major winners, just in general. And that's because tanking is substantially less stressful than it's been in years. Of course, there's good types of stress and bad types of stress. I would say the type that basically was bombarding you with so many things that you basically needed your UI to help you keep on top of them wasn't the good type of stress. So, that means if you've been thinking about trying out the tank role, well, Midnight basically is the time. And with that said, let's get into the specs. Blood DKs. For a long time, you guys have been one of WoW's more fragile specs. I say fragile in a weird way. Obviously, strong self-healing sounds great, but all that self-healing means that to challenge you, Blizzard has to crank up incoming damage higher than any other tank. And that means that if incoming damage is low enough, Blood is immortal. But the second that incoming damage gets too high, it is straight to health bar ping pong. So Blizzard's main challenge is solving that, but there is another little challenge, and that is this huge stack of unused abilities that crowd up your talent tree. So let's get into it. Now, you know how it is by now. Blood is losing Blood Tap, Rune Tap, Mark of Blood, and Blood Drinker. Basically, everything that allowed for more advanced resource management. And given Blood's recent history, I think none of those will really be missed. They're stragglers from years ago that Blizzard are finally cleaning out. Shattering Bone and Bonestorm, though, well, those actually are going away and they will really be missed. That seems like a lot, but by Blizzard's own admission, they realized they essentially turned Bone Shield into a third resource, and they now think that's too much for a spec that is already juggling its runes and its RP, which essentially means back to basics. So let's get into what those new basics will be. Obviously then, all those things that have been thrown away have been replaced by new talents. The new Blood Mist talent should help to make up for some of that lost damage and resources, and not just that either. Death Strike now hits 3 targets, and Blood Boil has plenty of cooldown reduction to help with your hematosis. Now on the defensive side, Death Strike lost some of its healing, and Lichborn no longer provides damage reduction, but to compensate, Bone Shield, Blood Shield, and parrying are all much stronger. Plus, consumption is actually different. Instead of just a button to hit, it's actually an empower ability that gives you more damage reduction the longer it is charged. And to smooth out other parts of the rotation, Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown is now a flat 90 seconds, and Coagulopathy, an amazing to say name, now only stacks 4 times. So ultimately, it is a slower spec, but it's easier to maintain. But there is actually something a bit odd about it. You see, for tanks, there's long been a bugbear, and that is random defensive uptime. So your defensive abilities just proc at random. Sometimes that's fine, if the proc happens to be well timed. Sometimes it's not, though. So it's been a pain for tanks, and that means I don't really know why their Apex talent has totally random Dancing Rune Weapon procs. It kind of feels like tank designers need to just share notes so that this sort of thing stops happening. Obviously, if you're a DPS player, this kind of thing is a bit annoying, but not as annoying. Though obviously, if you're a tank and that's going to be a core part of you surviving through something, yeah, it being pure random, well, random in an RPPM system isn't exactly going to be great. And I know this won't sound like the largest problem to many, but you have to remember something. This proc is part of your defensive budget. A part that can be completely wasted if it fires off when you're finishing off a pack or just not actively tanking the boss. So, that's that. A bunch of good things actually, but there is some loss here, and that is the rhythm of on-demand resources and damage that you can hold for the right moment. Where are we with Blood? Well, there certainly is some loss here. A lot of those things that went away helped you manage the rhythm, right? Of, your on-demand resource generation and on-demand damage. You could hold that kind of thing for the right moment. That sort of thing is gone. But DK has got plenty of other cooldowns to fill in the role, plus A-Bomb Limb is now a CC-only tool in your tree, and picking it or Gorfien's Grasp should be much easier with the new talent layout. Ultimately, I would say then, Blood is definitely a winner. It's leaner, it's beefier, it's much easier to keybind, and you have to remember that if all that stuff sounds really scary to you as a current tank in the current game, that's kind of intended. because in Midnight, tanking is going to be different, and this is an example of a spec that is changing to match those differences. Vengeance DH. So sometimes your first look at new talent tree immediately tells you a story, and Vengeance does just that. You see, for much of the War Within, Vengeance players ran a rather interesting build. It's one that completely skipped out Spirit Bomb, and that gave them a much more simple version of the spec. It worked really well, but it felt odd, and it was almost certainly completely unintentional. And to back that up, the Season 3 tier set heavily favored Fellscarred, which actually needed Spirit Bomb to function. It was all a bit weird, so now in the Midnight tree, we can see that Spirit Bomb is right here. You can't avoid it, it is part of the design, you will use it, and you guys have just been a bit naughty in the War Within, so here's your spanking. Thing is though, this is not really the same, right? It's not the same Spirit Bomb. Instead of being an alternative soul spender, it's actually a whole lot stronger and it's on a cooldown. You see, Vengeance gameplay used to revolve around where you would spend your soul fragments. You also needed to spend Fury, so the trick was basically to hit Spirit Bomb with high fragments and then dump Fury on Soul Cleave without them. Spirit Bomb ate fragments for damage, Cleave ate them for healing. And that's now all just gone. Soul Cleave does bonus damage for each fragment consumed, and it heals much more by baseline. Now the objective in your gameplay is still to have 5 fragments up for each soul bomb that you do, but you've now got a cooldown to work around instead of it just being every 3rd or 4th GCD. That's a lot of words. Basically, you got a 15-second metronome to help you pace out what you're doing. Now, that's probably the biggest change, but it's far from the only major one. Fracture is now your default filler, since basically nobody's used Shear for years. Fiery Brand is still a DPS button, but its damage reduction is now a self-buff instead of a debuff on the target, which is actually lovely. Before, of course, other mobs could still chunk you while your brand was spreading, so that's a really good quality of life improvement. Finally then, Demon Spike has a non-physical component while it's active that kind of replaces the counterintuitive buff that you previously got whenever it fell off. Then Painbringer, a relatively low-key but strong part of Vengeance, won't stack anymore. So in practice, right, that basically keeps your damage reduction from oscillating up and down like crazy. And to make up for any losses incurred in all of these changes, Fell Devastation now heals for a lot more, which does feel really damn satisfying. But the funny thing is that for all of how that stuff is nice and actually feels good when you're tanking, it doesn't really change how you'll actually play. So basically, Vengeance still does feel like Vengeance. Now, beyond that mechanical stuff, there is some quality of life. Infernal Strike now casts a free Sigil of Flame when opening combat, which saves you an awkward opener. Meta is down to a 2-minute cooldown, plus your Apex talent gives you procs to press it for free. So ultimately then, you've got some nice quality of life, you've got definitely some changes in how the talents are, but it should feel, I would say, largely similar, but without a lot of the, not just advanced gameplay, but I would say weird advanced gameplay that you had to understand to avoid mistakes at the higher levels. That being said, not every change is good. The most fun hero talent, sadly, is gone. Optimizing around Fellscarred procs for massive damage with the last tier set was a great rhythm. Now it's not really a thing, because now you get Annihilator instead. With it, Shadowflame meteors fall out of the sky, which is actually rad. Yeah, very cool. But it's got little impact on your actual gameplay, except for your Metamorphosis cooldown reduction. And then there's my least favorite change for last. Sigil of Chains now replaces Sigil of Misery whenever talented, so that's one less option for Mythic plus tanks to completely lock down packs. It was an extremely potent combo, kinda sad to see it go. Ultimately then, this is a same but different spec, right? It is different, I've covered loads of changes, but Vengeance is by and large still Vengeance. Spirit Bomb is your headline thing, but the minor defensive changes make it a lot more sensible and a lot more reliable. Losing the Chains Misery combo absolutely stings, but with Chaos Nova and Sigil of Silence, you're certainly not hurting for tools. There you go. Vengeance, you're a winner. Guardian Druid, you guys have had an odd time, and to be honest, if you are a Guardian Druid, maybe you're just a bit of an odd little guy, because what has Guardian been? I've been talking about Guardian in relation to just drama pretty much since Warlords of Draenor, so let's talk about it. It is a spec with an overwhelming amount of incoming rage and an off-global cooldown dump for that rage in the form of Ironfur. Now, playing it has felt like a nightmare because there's kind of so much going on. So to address that, Blizzard are pulling it all way down. Tooth and Claw's free procs are gone. Maul and Ironfur both cost full rage in Berserk. Maul can even cost extra rage for more damage if you have some rage to spare. You're also losing Earth Warden, which should make incoming damage a bit more reliable. In fact, you're also losing one of your biggest buttons for everything, and that's Rage of the Sleeper. Yeah, the Sleeper's no longer raging because he's just been deleted. Now, that may sound a bit scary, but it actually should make playing Guardian a hell of a lot smoother. Instead of just being extremely strong for 8 seconds every minute, you should just feel stronger at your baseline. I highly doubt anyone will really miss what's being removed. Things like, say, Pulverize. As much as Pulverize is a pretty dope word. Now, Guardian might also have the weirdest set of changes in Midnight. You are losing tons of buttons like everyone else, but you're actually getting genuine new gameplay mechanics. There's a new minigame for pulling Rage that will separate the great bears from the merely good bears. Rage of the Sleeper gets a replacement, but with more gameplay attached. Sundering Roar increases how high your Thrash can stack for a time, and then just burst mobs down for every stack whenever it expires. And for the Moon Bears, there's a now single target version of Moonfire. Red Moon turns Moonfire into a much stronger dot on cooldown, and it's all designed around extending it with Mangle. And Mangle can now have 2 charges, which makes that a whole lot more feasible. Now, on top of this redesign, there are other small issues that thankfully have been addressed. Finding time in your rotation to hit the free regrowth procs could actually be tough, so there's now a passive version if you just want to be able to focus on your tanking. Self-sustain is also a bit easier with Memory of Ysera. Frenzied Regen's incredible healing is also no longer wasted as much because it can now convert its overhealing into a shield. Quite lovely. But sadly, there are some things that haven't been finalized yet. Red Moon doesn't have 100% uptime, which seriously conflicts with your damage reduction and rage generation in a Moonbear build. That is frustrating because single target is really where Guardian Druids start to starve. Now, in multi-target, it's a much better spec with a more relaxed APM, just standing for actions per minute, so how crazy you're going on the keyboard. It's got some nicer tools. It's got more fun decisions to make as well. Now, in single target, that potential is there, but it just feels a little bit toothless, though that could be improved by Blizzard. Cat weaving also did take a hit as well, which will be sad to some. Basically, it is an advanced but genuinely rewarding option for Druid of the Claw adds, basically bears who love the challenge of being able to swap into a cat for a DPS boost. But sadly, that talent has been nerfed fairly hard. And on top of that, Heart of the Wild is very different now. Instead of just a few seconds of massive off-spec power, it's now just one chunky ability. So all of this means whether Guardian's a winner or not kind of depends on what you want from it. If Blizzard irons out the last few issues, I definitely say it'll be a drastically smoother spec to play, but it is a real change in feel. Now, you've got to manage your resources much more carefully. If you liked just mashing Ironfur every other GCD without a thought, and it was basically the default thing your fingers did, yeah, this version may feel quite different and a little bit slow. Brewmasters, right, the changes to you guys are surprisingly restrained. Now, Blizzard's pruning scalpel has very much been here, but it's not like they've chopped the thing to pieces. You can tell that maybe the designers are just a little precious about their ideas with this one. Let me explain. Rising Sun Kick is out as well, so that removes at least one button from another brutally packed rotation in World of Warcraft. Weapons of Order was a sort of half-cooked cooldown that was crowding things up, so it's been thrown into the bin as well. But rather oddly, the most nothing button of all time has actually survived. Rushing Jade Wind. It's still here. I know Special Delivery is a passive alternative, but I don't know how anyone could want to keep a 6-second maintenance AoE rolling. A bit weird. Anyway, most of this space has actually been filled up with some new toys for you to play with, and one of those new toys is Jade Fire. Crackling Jade Lightning is a little bit too iconic to merely just be ranged filler, so it now can be burst damage in AoE instead. There's also Vital Flame, a new source of sustain from your damage, so pretty neat. But there's another odd addition to this one. Chugging a brew gives you a fairly meaty speed buff, which definitely does line up with a few night outs I've had, but I don't exactly know, well, how that'll fit into the game. It's odd. Basically, you get both movement speed and attack speed from it, which does mean there's a chance you'll need to trade a good defensive timing for damage buff uptime? A slight chance, mind you. It's a funky wee thing, but there are actually just some more important problems to talk about with this one. Problems like Stagger. Okay, Stagger is a bit weird. One of Blizzard's constant struggles with Brewmaster is getting people to understand how to actually play the damn thing. Now, to counter that, they've made some big changes. So here they are. Purifying Stagger doesn't buff your shield brew anymore. It's just stronger baseline. The glow behavior has changed as well, where it now glows after spike damage instead of just whenever you're at high Stagger, which is, I'd say, way more intuitive. Blackout combo also used to interact with basically every ability. Now it only buffs your Keg Smash and your Tiger Palm. And that means there's a loss of technical depth, but here's the thing. I kinda don't imagine many players will truly deeply miss that, because there's still plenty going on with this spec. That's not to mention the rest of the game. Now, other things. Shadowpan is getting a rework as well. Instead of energy spend, it activates on each Keg Smash. And instead of damage building Flurry Strikes, auto attacks build Flurry Strikes, hence the whole attack speed buff that I mentioned earlier on. And instead of a crazy series of random buffs, the Capstone now just gives you a way to throw more Flurry Strikes out whenever New Zhao is up. Now, it's not a full rework, obviously. We still do have a lot of familiar things. Ox Stance's value is still basically invisible to anyone but the theory crafters. Blizzard still couldn't figure out what to do with New Zhao, so now he's just over here in the corner. He's gotten buffs to make sure he feels good to use, but he's been made a fairly heavy part of the Shadowpan talents. Overall, though, he seems positioned as an alternative to a exploding keg focus build located on the other side. But since New Zhao will be triggering Stomp and Blackout kicks instead of Purifying Brew, I kind of imagine he's not going to be ignored. So, a lot of things have changed. Their work here, I'd say, is far from done, but ultimately, they've actually done a fantastic job of cleaning up some complications without really doing lasting harm. So, tentatively, Brewmaster is a winner. Prot Paladins are a bit weird. They're not necessarily bad, but certainly over recent tiers, my own guild's tanking team has thought, damn, this really would be easier if you weren't playing Prot. So we should talk about stuff then. Our Season 3 rating was defined by one big thing: how much this spec sucked compared to the Vengeance DH. Our Paladin tank had to play out of his mind to survive scenarios that our Demon Hunter handled without a sweat. And I've brought that up in this video because clearly Blizzard knows why that is happening, and here we're about to see their attempt to fix it. So let's get into the changes. Of course, removing one of their defensive tools, it does seem like a bad start given what I just said. But Eye of Tyr was mostly fired on cooldown for damage, but it did have a strong defensive component that could prove useful. So to save a keybind, it's now gone, and all the Templar connections that it had are actually located on Divine Tool. So that's one change. There is another though, where at first glance, it seems Prot has lost its most important tool: Holy Shield. The talent is literally gone, but do not fret because it's actually been rolled into your mastery. Prot's mastery now increases block chance for melees and for spells, and it's kind of hard to say what that'll do for scaling, but it does actually have one benefit. It kills the old one, the old mastery. You see, the old mastery was a colossal pain in Prot's side. It was a damage reduction whenever you are plonked in Consecration. So at high levels of mastery scaling, far too much of your tankiness was conditional on you being in Consecration. If you were smacked outside, that would be that. You'd be dead. Blizzard's solution then has been to make Prot a whole lot more tanky by default. But they also kind of couldn't really help themselves, so the effect still does survive as a talent, but it's now limited to a flat 5%. Now, it's not the only conditional tankiness that they've addressed either. Prot had a bunch of stacking buffs that were almost invisible and almost all random. Talents like Redoubt and Barricade of Faith. Those things are now gone, and they're replaced by other bonuses. So basically, if you get tankier because of a talent, it's usually either baseline, you pick the talent and it makes you more tanky, or it's connected to an existing defensive, which should make buildcraft a bit more clear. Now, speaking of defensives, Prot has been visited by the Prune Monster. Eye of Tyr was the big victim, but Moment of Glory and Bastion of Light are gone as well, and on top of that, Hammer of Wrath is now a transformation to Judgment rather than being its own button. That is a lot of buttons gone. Not that you were using all of them anyway, which is actually where I've got to bring up some issues. You see, with all of this agency gone, Blizzard did kind of throw you a bone. You can now pick a second charge of Guardian of Ancient Kings. That's that. That's it. And hey, it might sound alright, but remember what a second charge really means. It means that unless you bank both of them for some reason, it's just one extra use throughout the entire encounter. one more defensive for a whole fight. And if that's a long raid fight, well, that's nothing. Which does leave Prot in a rather awkward spot. Blizzard promise it's going to be a lot tankier without having its defensives up, and the talent changes do support that. Even removing conditionals like Blessing of Dawn and Dusk, that stuff will all help. But yeah, it's just one more Guardian of Ancient Kings? I'm not really sure, but then again, we'll need to see what raid testing is like once the damn thing's actually live. What I will say is the experience of playing one won't really be that different. Look, you're still a utility powerhouse, and when it comes to keeping yourself alive, you don't really have a lot to do. You spam your filler, you keep your Shield of Righteousness up, job done. Except that's actually gotten more complicated, and that's because of this new talent choice. If you want extra damage, you can spend up to 5 holy power on a shield, which is what we in the business call a noob trap, because it's spending 60% more resources for 100% damage, which sounds really good, doesn't it? So this talent will let good players pump up damage, but it could get a few newer players killed. So calling this a winner is hard right now. Essentially, it hinges entirely on the maths. If it truly works out to be a tankier baseline, then Prot Paladin will feel tons better. But if the math is off, it may still suffer from lacking the defensive options that other tanks get for free. Protection Warrior time. You guys are fresh off the rework that turned you into a top tier S rank spec. And naturally, that means Blizzard are going to be very careful when it comes to any changes they make here. In fact, going by the number of patch notes alone, this is one of the least changed specs. But that's only if you look at this spec alone. You see, Warrior as a class has also got a totally revamped class tree. So let's get into things. For Prot, this means you are going to be losing some abilities. Everyone is. Notably, you're losing Thunderous Roar, which fed into your bleed damage and was great for AoE aggro. But to make up for that, Champion Spear has got a new leap attached to it. So you can basically nail a pack in place and then leap in their heads for bonus damage. S tier, I love it. And don't panic, by the way. Avatar is gone from the class tree, yes, but it's actually still located in your spec tree, so that's kind of good. Now, it doesn't keep the free shield wall effect that it used to have, sadly, but to solidify its place, Mountain Thane has now got some gameplay based around extending it. Now, for the opposite, we've got Rend, where Rend is something that now, if rather than living in a spec tree, is living in the Warrior class tree. Now, it still feeds you plenty of rage and AoE, so no change there, though something real funky's happened to one of your big defensive tools. Last Stand was moved to the class tree, and then it was moved to the bin. But it technically still lives on, albeit in a neutered form. It's a talent that buffs Shield Wall, so I guess you get that. Consolidations, I would say, work fine for your damage abilities, but for defensive, yeah, consolidating a bunch of things into one effect can be good, but actually more coverage is usually better than just having one humongous button, as we kinda just covered when talking about Prot Paladin. That being said, don't fret, because you do get some fun new tools. Piercing Howl still slows, but it also now acts as a miniature stampeding roar, so it'll buff up the movement speed of your team. Your stance mastery adds a lot of power to defensive stance, and Battlefield Commander leans into the fantasy that warriors have been missing. That's all quite good, and basically, Prot's own changes are fairly minor, but there are some things that stand out. Like, say, there's a talent that gives Ravage extra damage to your priority target, and then there's their new Apex talent, which will give Shield Slam a bunch of AoE damage, which will actually feel quite nice, quite handy. So, I'm calling Prot a winner for 2 different reasons. Reason number 1, the 11.2 changes are brilliant, and Blizzard have learned to not fix something that isn't broken, so that's good. Second then, the class tree really needed work, and it actually got plenty of good changes. So yeah, Prot, you're a winner. And with all that said, that's the tanks covered, but do not leave. Healers will be coming in the new year, but we have already done every melee DPS and every range DPS in the game, and you can watch that series of videos next. A little box will appear over here, and you can click on it.